Hey everybody, welcome back to Historians of the Movies podcast. I am your host and creator, Jason Herbert, and every single week we are bringing you movies and the histories behind them. And this week we are going to do something cool. We're talking about 1996's The Birdcage. And I wanted to bring on for you my friend Julio Capó Jr. Julio is a guy who loves Florida even more than I do. He is an associate professor of history at Florida International University. He's also the author of Welcome to Fairyland, Queer Miami Before 1940. Julio is a phenomenal scholar and has a world of information that we talk about today. We just recorded this podcast a few moments ago, and we talk about the development of Miami. We talk about queer Miami. We talk about the Birdcage and what it meant in 1996. We talk about what the Birdcage means now in 2024. We talk about Cuban Miami, and of course, Cuban coffee. Come on, you guys, you listen to this pod, you guys know what's going to happen. This is such an amazing and fun and delightful conversation. I had a blast, and I think you're going to too. I'm sitting here recording this intro knowing that you're going to enjoy the next 90 minutes. So that said, sit back and relax. The Birdcage is next on the Historians of the Movies podcast. I think we're rocking here. So good morning, dude. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
All right. So I drank my Cuban coffee this morning in anticipation of our pod. It's 9 a.m. my time. This is like the third, fourth, 12th time we've tried to do. I'm so happy that we've finally our schedules just kept going. So I'm so excited to be able to talk to you. Where are you now? Are you in Miami? Where are you?
You know, and also you're a bold man to drink some Cuban coffee. I love me some Cuban coffee, obviously, but it's not for the week of.
Okay.
So I love that. No, so I feel strange saying this because I'm such a Miami boy. I was born and raised, but I live in Fort Lauderdale now. I know, just a little north. And I moved there, true story, to be closer to my gay softball league. I felt like I'd rather commute for work than commute for play.
I have to tell you, I used to, I used to get down to Davie a lot. I was actually dating a Cuban woman down in Davie. So that encouraged my travel when I was living in Stewart. Down there, and my ex-wife and boys still live down there. And of course, when I was working for the Seminole Tribe of Florida, headquarters are down in Hollywood. So, I get to know Lauderdale quite well. I would always get my hair cut. I had this Colombian dude who would and his English was about as good as my Spanish. So it was an awful communication style, but awesome because the dude was good people. So I loved it, man.
It's interesting because actually it connects to so much of what we're going to talk today. The neighborhood, that is historically South Beach, moved north in some way. So there's this now kind of, one of the kind of most sustained, largest LGBTQ plus communities is Wilton Manors, which I live just outside of. And that large of it is actually kind of part of the story of what we are going to talk about today.
Dude, I'm so excited. I have to tell the Cuban coffee thing though, because it comes on. People are how are you? Jason, you were the whitest man in North America. You have no right to drink Cuban coffee. And I'm like the ambassador. Do you ever go down to my buddy runs the Tamiami Orchid Festival. Are you familiar with this at all? They do this massive thing down there.
I know of it. I don't think I've ever been.
He brought me there he asked me to help out one time, and he brought me to La Carreta one night, right? After we helped, right? And for you guys listening, there are a few different Cuban restaurants in Miami that you should probably know, and La Carreta is certainly one of them. And it's 10 p.m. at night. He's try this. And I was what's this? I was let me have another. He's no.
Oh, you had the coffee. You had the coffee.
I had Cuban coffee 10 p.m.
At 10 p.m.? Good for you.
Oh, yeah.
Good for you, girl.
And then I was let me have another one. He's no, you cannot. So now, first thing I do is I make mine every morning because I don't want to
You have a cafetera and everything? You have the espresso?
Oh, yeah, claro. Oh, and I have the espumita. right? And oh, buddy,
You make your
like
own espumita.
oh, claro. Yeah, it's in the kitchen right now. Like, and I've done like videos. I'm like, you have to beat this sugar like it owes you money.
Yeah.
Like you have to really whip, like turn it into this like pasty, whippy. Because if you don't get right, you have to dump it out. If you put too much coffee into your sugar when you're starting to whip it up, it doesn't work.
It's an art. I learned how to do espumita and how to do my coffee age 6 or something, right? Like, I mean, it's kind of like a entry into life. But also La Carreta, for those who don't know, is, I mean, till this day, my favorite Cuban restaurant. And like, there's different, like, it's a huge chain now.
Yeah, it
Probably
is.
has been for a minute. Like, so you can get versions of it at the airport, and often folks do. Like, if they come to Miami and they're just in the airport for a minute, they get to go to La Carreta airport or whatever. But it's not the same. Go
It's
out and go to
fine. It's fine.
Little Havana or something and like
Right.
check out the. But that's awesome. Yeah, I love La Carreta.
Have you ever been? Did you ever go to Havana in West Palm Beach?
No, I don't get to West Palm Beach often, to be frank.
Dude,
Yeah.
well, you're not in Lauderdale. Like, isn't it amazing? Like when you're living in South, so for those of you living who have not lived in South Florida, like once you get down there, it's like going more than like 15 miles is like, dude, I am just not doing that today. Like it's just like you become, very much like set in your ways,
Well, that's what I said. Really, what I meant when I was like, I moved to
dude.
the county above. Like, it's like I felt like I needed a passport to move to Broward because, people always joke, they make that reverse joke. And I'm like, I don't know, Miami is it's a joke that I don't love, but like, that is Miami's everything to me. And I'm there all the time. Like, that is, I physically live here to be close to my gay softball mates and and to the neighborhood really in earnest. But my partner and I love it here, but we're always in Miami. My family's there. I work there. I'm at FIU, Florida International University in Miami. So Miami's home.
Yeah, yeah, I love it it's really grown on me as I've gotten older. Like for a while, I moved to West Palm Beach when I was like 22. And West Palm was like home, and I'm like this kid from Kentucky, and I was like South Florida, and I'm like, what is this place, and so forth. But Miami was like this foreign place because it was like an hour and a half south, and I never felt
Right.
cool enough to hang out. Like there was like this classist thing for me where I was like not pretty enough, or like, I'm sorry, but like I was so afraid to go down to like South Beach because like that's where the beautiful people were, and I
That's where
was
the
like.
models.
Yeah, right?
For a minute, it was the capital, like the model capital of the world, for sure. Like it's in this film, for example. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah,
I hear
absolutely.
you. I'm not saying you're not pretty. I'm just saying, like, I'm not
Thank you.
I like. I mean, I'm not saying.
I
Like,
know. I know what you
saying
mean. No, there's like there's like it's not like pretty. It's like this hip, cool like element. I don't. Yeah, it was this thing. I don't know.
I get you. I mean, and for a lot of folks in Miami, that's also true. Like that is like,
Yeah.
there's 8,000 Miamis, and like South Beach
Oh, thank you.
does not Miami make.
No. Right there. There's Little Havana. There's Little Haiti. There's all these other places.
Yeah.
And that's actually what I love about we'll get into this, right? The idea about Miami is this incredibly diverse space. Because I think sometimes, and this is not a negative, right? The connotations of Miami is like this either super hip place or this Cuban American place will overwhelm ideas of what it is. And I think one of the cool things that your book does is talks about how diverse of a space that this is. And hopefully that's what we're going to talk about today as we talk about the Birdcage. But before that, I want to talk about you.
Yay! I love that.
Good. That's why we're here, man.
If there's one thing I love, I'm kidding. It's a joke.
We're here. It's beautiful
I don't
people
know.
with Jason and Julio. How are you? So go on.
Yeah, before I'm a historian of 19th and 20th century U.S. history, U.S. Caribbean relations. I see myself equally as a historian of the Caribbean. So much of my research comes out of the Bahamas, of Cuba, of Haiti, and those archives. And I wrote a book called Welcome to Fairyland, Queer Miami Before 1940. I also like to think of myself, like I can, as a as a public facing scholar. I curate a lot of exhibitions. I just curated an exhibition that closed about 2 weeks ago, on Sorita. Sorita was a lesbian burlesque dancer who was really big in Miami in the 1930s and 40s. She moves to Miami later, but she kind of makes a big splash, by the
Oh my
40s.
gosh.
Amazing. I have this, and anyway, it's been a fun project, but largely thinking about how we right translate the work we do to broad audiences. So I teach at FIU, Florida International University. Before coming home to Miami, I taught and I earned tenure at UMass Amherst. I was there for almost a decade. But
Wow.
I came back 2019 just in time for the pandemic, which was a weird time to be back in South Florida. But I've been back since 2019.
Okay, I have so many questions to ask you, and as HATM has continued to evolve, one of the things I really wanted to start doing, and I was thinking about this recently, was I really wanted to start understanding like how people are getting into history and like what drew you into becoming a storyteller, right? And this public facing scholar, like I'm so jealous of you in some ways because you got to go home. Like being at FIU, like I mean, not that
Yeah.
UMass Amherst is not this amazing place.
No,
I
I
have
hear
friends
you.
up there, right? But like,
Yeah.
good for you, right?
Thank I hear you, and like I don't mean to interrupt, but like UMass
No,
Amherst was a great home for me, and like
totally.
I was treated really well there. It was an incredible program. I loved my time there, and I learned so much there. So it's not, but the idea to come back home, so to speak, right, and serve the community that raised me, and that sounds really cheesy, but it's 100% true. Anyone who knows me knows what that means to me, and that's special. Like FIU is one of the largest, if not the largest, HSI Hispanic serving institution in the country. Um, it's in a place that I understand. Like it feels it feels and looks like me. There's parts of it that don't look and feel like me.
Totally.
That is like Florida and Miami are constantly changing, but it's meaningful work for me, and I mean that really sincerely. So and I don't know, how did I get into this? Like by accident, if
Yeah.
I'm honest. Like I was a non-degree seeking student. Like I had no business being a historian, and I was a journalist. I worked in broadcast news for a few years before here in the local Miami stations at Fox and ABC. And then I was a non-degree seeking student for like a year and a half, and doing being actually getting I got my undergrad at NYU and then moved back home, and taking part-time classes again at FIU, where I now teach. And that kind of became, that is entirely, I don't want to say by accident, but something akin to accident. Like that is, I had no business being a historian. And I enjoyed journalism. I used to work the night shift. I would get in at midnight and leave at like 8 in the morning, 9 in the morning. I was the producer of a 7 a.m. show. So I feel like I've been telling stories in that way, like that is, and doing research in like that kind of public facing way for a while, telling an important story in 20 seconds, like over a voiceover, a VO or something, is very different work than what we do today. But it taught me really important lessons about meeting deadlines, about making work accessible, about the importance of community-based work. Like, I mean that sincerely, like that is just, never something that's extractive. Like, what does it mean to tell someone's story who's facing trauma is these are the kinds of things you also learn as a journalist, and having respect for people's stories and for people's time. And there's differences, obviously, I think massive differences between historians and journalists, but it helped me kind of think about what I wanted to do, and I think it made me a better historian. Or not. If folks disagree, that's fine.
No, no. If they disagree, they're wrong.
They're
Well,
wrong.
exactly. That's our stance here. Isn't it? Though? I mean, but aren't journalists just real time historians? That's isn't
Yeah.
the work so similar?
It is, but we're not thinking about the things the same way. Like that is, we're not asking the same kinds of questions, which I think is part of the problem. Is like I think journalists would be better suited by taking some more history classes, and historians would be better suited by taking some journalist classes,
Some writing
and
classes,
thinking
for
about,
God's sakes. But yes,
for sure, like, right, if we can make more work accessible and presentable. I'm now one of the editors for the Made by History section, for example. I've been doing that for a few years. I'm at Time Magazine. We moved from Washington Post to Time about a year ago now. and like that is it's a skill we all need to learn, that we all need to use more. Too often we're writing for ourselves or for those who are like us, right? That is in terms of the academy just in general. And there's things about that obviously that make me super uncomfortable, and I hope it makes us all really uncomfortable, because that's not what good history does in my estimation. Yeah.
Yeah, good history is hard history, right? We're
Yeah.
asking hard questions, things that, and like, I always talk to people, I'm like, the job isn't to make you necessarily feel bad, or like, not to, I'm not trying to like be exploitative of your feelings or anything like that. But at the same time, like, there are parts of history that comes with like confronting the past, right?
I hope so, right? Like that is, without being super cheesy, and I mean this so sincerely. To me, history is healing, right? Like that is, it offers us an opportunity for healing, right? Like that is, if there is just no way of doing reparative work if we're not also thinking about confronting the past very honestly, very forthright. That's raw, and there's a lot of it that there's violence, there's trauma that comes along with it, no doubt, and you're sensitive to that. But like you said, it's not about guilt, right? Like, but it is about healing, and the only way that I think that we can move towards that direction is really telling history as it is. That's uncomfortable, and that's okay. Like that is, it's this what we, our so many of our politicians, like, this little Floridian, who
Oh,
keeps talking of.
we're gonna get into that. We have a section called "What the Florida" that we'll talk about. So
I love that. I might, steal and cite that.
please do so. You don't have to steal. I bequeath it to my fellow Floridian here, sir.
Thank you. We
It's
could
my
use the
honor.
help.
It is my honor, sir. And actually, it brings up to part of the reason why I was very familiar with you for the longest time, because I'd seen a lot of your work on Twitter. It's one of the things I really always admired was how available you were to everybody and things like that. We share a lot of the same mutual friends inside the I don't know, the business, the academy, whatever.
The
And
industry.
the industry inside the matrix of history, right? But one of the things I'm really trying to do with HATM in some rights, I'll tell you, is, I'm not a native Floridian. We all know this. I'm from Kentucky. But as I've started to internalize this, like how I feel about Florida, and this is the way I talk about Florida now, it's like, I was born in Kentucky, but my home is Florida. Florida is really what made me who I am, right? It is, in my mind, Julio, home to me. When I think about what people ask me, where is home? I think of Florida first now.
Yeah.
I've done the math. I've actually spent more time in Florida than anywhere else, and it's entirely possible to love more than one place, certainly, and whatnot. But it's like, now I wanted to think about it with HATM. How do we tell stories? Because Florida gets the shit beat out of it in popular media, right? Like the Florida man, and there's this little Ozempic Napoleon running around. I heard that the other day on Twitter. I stole that. I was like, Robandolo. So,
Look at
but
you with the Spanish.
I try. I throw it out there every now and then. I want to tell these real stories about Florida as well that are not the butt of somebody's jokes, and that's part of the reason why I want to talk to you about Fairyland. Talk to you about Miami. I want to talk about these real amazing stories of real people who lived and struggled and came through and all these different stuff. And I thought maybe we could do this through movies. So
I love
reached
that.
out.
Who doesn't? I love that. Thanks for reaching out. This is fun.
Dude,
And like,
I'm so excited.
Thanks, me too. Florida is not taken seriously, just to say that. And like, I have lots of thoughts on that. So I'm looking forward to telling you all I think about the Florida. La Florida.
You know what? It is. All right. So let's get into La Florida. All right. So when I reached out to you, we're like, hey, let's talk about some movies. And I thought about your work. What do we want to do? And we kind of settled. You were like, hey, how about the Birdcage? Because I was like, what kind of movie do we want to do? And you were like, Birdcage. I was like, perfect. Everyone loves this movie. Why did you want to do the Birdcage? Like, why specifically this film?
Selfishly, and as always, I like to think I'm really honest. I hadn't seen it in many years, and I kind of wanted to revisit it. Like that is with kind of fresh eyes. I knew it was having a little renaissance as it kind of comes into an anniversary. Just a year and a half from now, there will be a big 30th anniversary
Crazy.
of Birdcage. I know, like I remember when it came out, and then I came out. No, I'm kidding. But I mean, I just the significance of it. Like I was curious how it had aged. Like I wanted to rewatch it with kind of fresh eyes. I think it's a film that kind of just has a lot of caricature, like so much of Miami, but I wanted to think about it in a different lens. Like I hadn't seen it since my book came out, for example, at least since then. And I curated this big exhibition in 2019 at History Miami Museum that had like clips of it, and I'd seen clips here and there, but I hadn't thought about it in like a serious way. And like I kind of was like, you know what? If there's someone who thinks that, I like to think that I think of, I take these things seriously. Like that is. Film is important, and so many people get their ideas about places like Miami from places like the Birdcage, and there's both truth and mistruths, and all the kind of eleganza that comes along with South Beach in this period that is both accurate and inaccurate. So what it got right, what it got wrong, and why it both matters. Like I was interested.
Yeah, and I was thinking if this film comes out in '96, this is watching this. There are all these allusions to the changing demographics of the United
Yeah.
States, fears of marriage equality, things like that. In this film, and it felt like as I watched it, and you're absolutely right. Like going back to rewatch this film, I'd only seen clips of this film prior to,
Yeah.
and then I sat down and watched it again. This celebration of this, I mean, mainstream celebration of gay culture in 1996. Does this start? Are we at a turning point in the 1990s at this point in time? I mean, what's going on when you look at this film, say 28 and a half years later?
So, I mean, you hit the nail on the head for me because I was thinking about it in these kinds of terms too. Like, that is, if we think about the mid 90s, this is radically changing. And I think we're still at this point as historians, as scholars, as thinkers, as people navigating this world who are now really looking back to the 90s in particular to better understand where we are today. And 90s have kind of largely been, I don't want to say like overlooked or ignored, but largely overlooked and ignored. This is part of what Nikki Hemmer, like his work is doing. And I really appreciate the partisan, that book, The Partisans. I was actually rereading it a few weeks ago. And we're, so much is happening. So for example, HIV/AIDS becomes a manageable disease, right? If taken with the cocktail, right? There's massive immigration reform in the mid 90s. And by reform, I mean actual criminalization. There's shift in immigration policy. So when we see characters in the film that are kind of there as a comedy only, that's not the story of immigration at this very, very moment. The end of welfare as we know it. And these kinds of moments in the 90s that are kind of just in the background of this film. Like they're just, and in fact, kind of not really, Ellen DeGeneres hasn't come out yet. Will and Grace hasn't premiered yet. There's not a lot of gay culture that's available to folks. I remember when this movie came out, it was, just as a queer person who wasn't out, I'm of a certain age, and there wasn't much for us to see, and there wasn't a lot to see as a queer person of color. Your options were really limited, and usually the source of comedy and derision and violence. So this is it's a problematic film in other ways. I don't want to like anything. I feel like it's our job to just be, everything is problematic.
Let's beat the shit out of everything, right?
But it is also a celebration, and I don't want to diminish that because I do think it offers us so many windows into forms of joy, into forms of community, into forms of family, and different ways that people build families. But no doubt, you could see it here. There's jokes about I don't know, same-sex marriage, or even kind of talking point about don't ask, don't tell. There's just kind of, things that are dropped in the film that make you realize, right, we're at this kind of precipice for change. Watching it now almost 30 years back, 30 years later, that we get a sense of this moment of it's a snapshot into the 90s in ways that I really appreciated. To say nothing, I like the way you worded it, the demographic changes, right? I have to admit that when I first saw it, 'cause it had been many years, as I said, probably last time I saw it was when I was a kid, like 30, when I was a small, very young person. Oh, I'm kidding. I wasn't that young. But like one of the things that I don't want to say I forgot, but that I took different meaning when I was rewatching it now, was the significance of the changing Jewish community in South Beach, right? Which
Absolutely.
I caught on to that when I was young, but now kind of looking at it differently,
It hits
um,
different.
it does hit differently. And like in part because I also remember like growing up in Miami, like things like there's a Holocaust memorial in South Beach,
I've been there. Yeah.
and it's incredibly powerful. And I remember going to that when I was a kid, like in elementary school. Like we took a visit there. It was new then. Like that is like that is it's like the movement for that starts in the 80s, but it doesn't kind of like come into fruition. It doesn't like inaugurate or open until 1990. So not too far from when this film kind of premieres. And but at that time the South Beach is radically transformed, in no small part by a gay community, right? A growing gay and tourist-driven, often community, who, in the absence of government care for their lives, found new ways of celebrating life, in the form of nightlife culture. South Beach becomes a thing, right? Like in earnest, right? In the 90s. And South Beach had radically changed. But what happens to that Jewish community that had helped build so much of that space in the meantime is a part of the story that could easily get lost. But to say nothing about the preservationist efforts, we almost lost all those Art Deco buildings, for example. And like, to talk about tragedy, to me, one of the best parts of just being in that space is the gorgeousness and the
Oh my
colors
god,
and
pour
the
Art Deco into my soul, dude.
yeah,
Like
yeah, me
that is my
too.
architectural jam. Right? I look at that all day.
Yeah,
I have so many questions based off just what you
yeah,
said. Like, okay, I got a couple things right now. Especially we're talking about gay communities in the United States, and Julio, forgive me if I use the wrong terminology here, and so forth as we move here.
I will correct you. I have no problem. I'm kidding.
Good, good. That's well. I tell you, one of the things I really want to be able to do with this pod is use these as opportunities to address my
Yeah,
own ignorance in different areas of historical inquiry. Right? It's like I
very
don't know
fair.
about this stuff. Let's go because this shit is cool. Right? How does say the gay community in Miami? Is it different than say the South Beach moment in say the mid-90s? Is it different than like what's going on say in San Francisco? Or these where are are there other large, well-established gay communities? Obviously there are gay communities all over the United States, right? But like when we think about these spaces, these hubs,
Yeah.
like that we think about, how does it compare to like places like San Francisco or even a place like Key West? How is Miami different or similar
Oof.
than other spaces?
Just a tiny question.
Yeah, you have 3 hours to respond.
Get ready. No, like it's a great question and a super fair one. And it really also depends on what period we're talking about. Like if we're talking about this moment in the 90s, there's massive changes in the city. I guess for starters, I'll just say that, like, and we already talked about this a little bit, but it's so important for folks to know, because I actually don't think that a lot of folks who don't like know South Florida well don't necessarily appreciate that Miami and Miami Beach are different municipalities. Like they're actually very different. And like to this day, like you watch, I don't know, whatever, Dexter or I don't know,
Golden
Nip
Girls.
Tuck or like Golden Girls. And like
We're
like
gonna do a
this is how
Golden
people
Girls pod at some point in time. It's gonna be on. You're invited, sir. I demand you come back.
I'm scared to say this out loud because I feel like I'm going to get personally attacked, not by you, but by others. But I'm not I don't. I've seen the Golden Girls like here and there, but I'm not like I've never seen like the
It's like
full
this
run.
thing. Oh, I
I
had
know.
other
So
things to say.
everyone, please just tell me that I'm a horrible person. I get it. I just don't watch that much TV, and like but I do love the Golden Girls when I see it. Like that is when it's
Love the
on, and I
idea of
laugh,
the
and I'm
Golden
like,
Girls.
it's
Right.
right,
Yeah.
right, and it's aged very well, and it's really
Totally.
progressive for its time, and all those things. so anyway, just like, I'm not like, I'm scared to like, tell me episode 7. I'm like, I don't know, girl. But anyway, so neither here nor there. But so they're different municipalities, and that's really important because they also have different histories. Like, one is founded in 1896, that is Miami, and Miami Beach is 1915. And like, they cater to radically different communities at different times in their histories. So even though they sometimes have like overlapping histories, they're also really distinct. And that's kind of true. Like, we talk about Miami as like this kind of one thing, but it's kind of like a constellation of different cities, like, and municipalities, like proper municipalities, from Hialeah to Coral Gables to, Aventura. Like, that is like, it's just not one place, and they are radically different histories. And Miami is, and this is so important to say, deeply segregated, right? Like, that is, so many people think of Miami, and here I use Miami as like greater Miami, like the kind of larger metropolitan area, as being really diverse, because it is, but that doesn't mean that it's not segregated, or that there's like equal access to resources or even representation, and so on and so forth, right? Like, that is, Little Havana and Little Haiti and Little Managua and Little Venezuela, like, there's, to say nothing about the historic Black communities that have historically been shifting, right? Like, that is, as land development and real estate became more desirable, and Black communities kept getting pushed out of their homes, right? So like, that is, there's so many kind of difficult, violent histories in the making of Miami and the place we know of Miami. Miami Beach had restrictionist covenants for everyone, really, that wasn't a white non-Jewish person, right? Like, that is, it was really common for hotels and motels to say Gentiles only. Like, that is, was really common. Carl Fisher's, properties, and we talk about Fisher Island, which is mentioned in the Community. This is part of that story too. So as we it depends on the period. What I would say too is that places like South Beach, where almost all of the Birdcage takes place, really was in transformation during the time that this film, is taking place. It's radically transformed by a number of immigrant communities, right? After 1959, especially, but certainly before then too, Cuban Americans come to Miami and South Florida in much, much larger numbers. It creates the largest diasporic community of Cubans. After 1979, we see that with Nicaraguans, and that's the creation of places like Little Managua and Sweetwater, right? And in today, Venezuela and parts of Colombia and Brazil. Like, so there's no doubt, to say nothing, right, again, of the massive migration of Black folks from different parts of Florida, from different parts of the South. And then, of course, Black immigrants. Early in Miami's history, Black Bahamians were the largest immigrant group in Miami. I focus a lot of my attention in my book about the Black Bahamian community that helped build so much of the infrastructure of Miami, including the railroads, including so many, like the sky, so many of the kind of early structures were built by Black immigrants. And in more, of course, like these overlapping demographics, that is Afro-Cubans, Afro-Venezuelans, so on and so forth. And of course, the Haitian community and the largest diasporic community that is South Florida of Haitians. It so radically transforms the space, and that, of course, also impacts its LGBTQ history. There's no way of talking about Miami and South Florida's LGBTQ history outside of, of course, and this is true of anywhere, but that is like, this is outside of race, outside of ethnicity, outside of migration. I say that it's important to note that that's true of everywhere, even though, of course, there is a unique history to South Florida's, shifting of local politics in relationship to all these things together. So like, if we talk about anti-bilingualism in the city, it's related to gay history. It's related to anti-Black history. It's related to the changing demographics of Spanish speakers and Haitian Creole speakers, so on and so forth. But anyway, they've always been really integrated. That was my long way of saying it's complicated, and it depends on when we're talking about.
I love it. Thank you. Because you and I both love Florida so much. And I just feel like it's a space that I want other people. I do, right? Florida breaks my heart, especially in its current situation right now. But I still it breaks my heart because I love it so much.
Yeah,
it is this space. So when you talk about Miami and things like that, I'm just like, I just want to go and be there, like right now, to experience it, embrace it for all of its drama and all of its heartbreak, but all of its success. Because ultimately, these are the stories of immigrants who come and create their lives, or people who are gay, who are forging their lives, regardless of what these outside forces say about who they can or cannot be. Like these are very human stories, right? That we can
Yeah.
tell in the sunshine, right? I want to ask you about this film because I feel like we do have to talk about the representation on screen here.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Robin Williams as a gay man on screen, say in 1996, because I think understandings of who should or portray or not this is a contentious issue
Yeah.
across the spectrum on screen. So, can we talk a little bit? What are your thoughts on Robin Williams portraying a gay man as he was? He was not gay. Is this okay? Is this a thing to be embraced? It's complicated, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I guess everything's complicated, or maybe we overcomplicate things. I don't know. You know
Probably
what's
both.
funny? Yeah, I was thinking something similar, but I have to admit, but it was actually like in terms of Hank Azaria representing the
Yeah.
Guatemalan. Like,
Yeah, I felt that was even. I felt that one was probably. I was like, we'll get to Hank.
that one hurt me, I have to
A
say.
little
But
bit.
like, so Robin Williams, I was thinking about this again differently now as an adult man. Like in a different context and as a queer Latino guy, right? Like that is like. So I was also just, um, you know, Robin Williams was in a different part of his career, which again, I don't think I appreciated when it was happening in real time. Like at this point, I had to research this because I didn't remember. He had already done Aladdin. He had already, which is a very queer character, and has kind of been reimagined by Disney as a very kind of openly queer character in more recent years. And of course, had done Mrs. Doubtfire, which has its own right. Like that is, in some ways, this is his more tame like representation of queerness, like that is less femphobic in some, like this film is pretty femphobic, like that, I'll say that, like that is like the fear is largely not necessarily on sexuality, but what they really don't want is ostentation, ostentatious behavior or flamboyancy, and like kind of your mannerisms, and that whole like pinky scene with like Nathan Lane, and like, who, by the way, I
God
was
bless
thinking,
Nathan Lane.
oh my God, I have to admit, I love Nathan Lane. Also, neither here nor there, but did you know that Nathan Lane starred in The Nance, which was George Chauncey, of course, Gay New York, and an
Thank
awesome
you.
scholar in person, wrote this important book called Gay New York. And they turned it into like a Broadway show called The Nance, like, I don't know, 10 years ago now.
Are
It's no
you
longer on Broadway.
serious?
Yeah, I saw it back then. And it starred Nathan Lane. And it kind of reminded me, like it's loosely, I think his character, if I'm not mistaken, I could be making this up, but I don't think I am. It's been a minute. I want to say that Nathan Lane's character was called like either George or Chauncey or something like that, is in honor of George Chauncey, of course, because the play was loosely based on that history, in this kind of pansy craze, or so to speak, in the 1930s New York.
Oh,
But
we're
like
coming
that
back to
is
that book in a bit.
okay. I mean, I love talking.
I can't read your book without thinking about that book. It's yeah. But go on. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, don't be. So like, I don't know. It's this moment of I forgot what I was talking about as I started talking about the name. Oh,
Nathan Lane.
representation.
We're just going,
Yeah, I don't
dude.
know how I got. Yeah, I do think that there's if this there weren't out gay characters and out gay actors at this moment. That is, I think we also have to put it in the context in which there wasn't this kind of Hollywood was different. And I'll also just say, because I always think that these things kind of just, we always imagine, even though it was always incredibly queer, right? Like that is, even when the Hays Code, for example, like prohibited same-sex, representation, same-sex love and desires in film, they always found ways to do it anyway, right? Like coded and sometimes not so coded. And so that is like, I want to just kind of point to the fact that lots of activists helped change this world for Hollywood, right? That is, today we do have much more openly gay actors, and that's but there in the 90s it simply wasn't. Like again, like Will and Grace hadn't premiered, Ellen hadn't come out. Like these are pivotal pulp culture moments that help change the landscape. No doubt, like in a kind of large and mainstream way. And in this way, I kind of want to see the Birdcage, or kind of want to view it as like being really important to that step, right? And this is maybe strange. I read their, and maybe I'm being a little, I don't know, generous. there's a queerness to Robin Williams that I also don't want to erase, right? Like that is who had kind of historically like a lot of actors simply wouldn't have taken this role either.
Right. Totally. Exactly. Because of fears of what it would do to the career.
Right. And he had already done, two very queer, almost back to back, right? Like, I mean,
Mhm.
if not exactly back to back, right? Like, so, I mean, that is, I appreciate his and want to historically think about what it must have meant for him to take on this role alongside, right, Nathan Lane, and take and do this performance. So like for sure, I don't want to be like, oh, representation doesn't matter. Of course it does, but we were also in a different time, and I also just want to acknowledge what that means historically.
I think you're absolutely right. Like I was thinking about this term, like the idea that Robin Williams was like America's like happy, safe he wasn't he was like everybody loved Robin Williams, and the idea that he would step into these roles seemed to
Yeah,
me like an embracer of
welcoming people
this
in.
is yeah, absolutely right.
For
Like
sure. And also, like, historically, and actually, George writes about this, that is, George Chauncey writes about this too. And lots of, queer historians or people who study LGBT history have also talked about this. But historically, the way that some, especially in film and literature, that some of the ways that people talked about queer stuff was through the lens of comedy, right? That is, it kind of, it allows people to poke fun of things that they're not comfortable with, in ways that no doubt could be really hateful and problematic and discriminatory and exclusive, exclusionary. But it also did provide a platform for people to see themselves, or people who look like themselves, or people who might want to look like them, X, Y, or Z, right? And again, largely for like white queer folks, right? Like that's largely what it looks like in this, especially at this moment. Like it was hard for me not to, again, as an adult now, like thinking about this film, like to see Callista Flockhart in this
she's an
role.
infant in this movie.
She's an infant. One, she's an
Oh
infant,
my
and
gosh.
two, it makes me want to watch, or maybe hate watch. I don't know. Like I don't know what that's going to look like. Ally McBeal, which also hadn't premiered yet, but like this, it's this very, I'm thinking about like Lisa Dugan's like Twilight of Equality. This is very neoliberal gay culture, right? Like we're getting a very clear sense of almost like like now thinking about Ally McBeal, this kind of white feminism, politics and culture that emerges from a show like that, even as it also of course had really progressive things. Like I think about the gender neutral bathrooms or something, right? That existed in Ally McBeal, or something that are contemporaneous to this film, and it got me thinking about them differently, right? As bathrooms are again back in like the popular imaginary or something, but like it's hard to not, because we're of a certain age, not me but you, kidding, but like but like to watch this with different
Jason
eyes,
applies
right?
skin cream as we're
Just
going here.
kidding. Oh my god, I'm not an ageist.
But it's the year. It's not the years, man. It's the mileage. So
That's a good, yeah, that's fair.
I still love Indiana Jones. Everyone's
Oh,
got to have
there
a
you go.
hero.
Well, you cited it, so it's fair game.
Absolutely.
So anyway, watching it, it's if we're going to watch this, as a piece of history, which it is, like, and then kind of treat it the way we would treat a kind of piece of history, like understand the politics and culture in which it emerges, and all the things that come along with that.
All right. We got to talk about Azaria real fast. Williams, I think we go back, if this movie were remade now, if Robin were still with us, God bless him.
Hmm.
Right. Azaria, probably not in that role again.
I have to say, and I don't know enough about him or his politics or his
Right.
outside of like The Simpsons or something, right? Like I think
Sure.
he's like, and
He's
like I mean that
tremendous
is a
actor.
tremendous actor, and like I will say I think my favorite character by far in this film, which again is something I appreciate now as an older person, that is not when I first saw it, is Gene Hackman. I find I mean, I always thought he was like a
It's
genius, but
amazing.
I actually think his acting here and his role as like this kind of this conservative congressman, senator, right, like from
Yeah.
Ohio, in this kind of like almost like the one of the co-founders of almost like this moral majority kind of founded later, but like
This is
this
very
this kind of,
Gingrich era, right?
yeah, I was actually trying to think like who were they loosely basing this off of? And the like, it is like a Newt Gingrich kind of person,
He's
right?
not
Like
married
almost
enough times, but yeah.
he's not controversial enough, and he's not like Contract of America y enough. But like there's things of like there's a Newt Gingrichnesss. I
Bob
like to make up
Dole-ish,
words.
something.
And it's,
Yeah,
I only didn't think Bob Dole because he talks about Bob Dole as someone else. Like
right.
that is like he mentions Bob Dole, so it means he
That's
can't.
right.
But
Yeah.
anyway, but like anyhow, like he's such a, and then at the end when he embraces this kind of out of like self-interest, there's something really queer about Gene Hackman's character in this film, and his embrace of it. Um, for Hank, the kind of performativity here of Guatemalanness, which is, I think, a word that they literally use in the film. Like, I actually think that they say that, um, for me, was the most icky part of this film.
Cringe, I think, is what the kids say.
Cringe, yeah. I don't know what the kids say. It's very cringe. Did I sound young? Did I sound young and
Totally.
pretty?
You're rocking.
Um,
Go ahead.
I found that character to be so one note, in a way that I like. He almost serves no purpose outside of just kind of being in the subservient role of being, just a kind of rod for like laughter, usually very cheap laughter, never kind of given a sense of intelligence, of dimension or depth. It's also a really white film. I don't think that there are real black characters in this film. Like anyone who's given any kind of depth. There's no one who's darker skinned. Like there's a South Beach was a lot of things, and one of those, like, I in that way I also kind of wanted to say it's also part of that history, is that historic South Beach was pretty, especially it's kind of gay Mecca era, right? Like as we kind of think about it that way, was still very white and white presenting. So like that is, but even then, the characters here can be really one dimensional in terms of ethno-racial constructions, and the fact that they chose to make Hank a Guatemalan, for example, is interesting in and of itself. Like there is a substantive Guatemalan population in South Florida, but they live usually much further south. Like that historically has been further south. That would be less true for queer Guatemalans, for example. But the likelihood would have been for one of these characters to have been Cuban, Nicaraguan. There was a kind of almost like, I don't know, like they tried to let's make one Latino character, so we can nod to this history that we know is kind of there, but not really give it any kind of attention or nuance or texture. And maybe Hank did what he could with it and whatever, but it is the most cringe to now steal the young people's stuff, I thought. Yeah.
All right, I want to ask you. I want to come up to a section here we've only recently coined, and this is when Joanne Freeman was recently on the podcast when we were doing a Franklin episode called the codfish moment. Bear with me. We're talking about codfish in the American Revolution. They turned out to be this huge. There's no cod in Miami. We eat dolphin down in Miami. It's not flipper. It's mahi, but we call it dolphin in Florida. But the idea is like, was there a moment here in this film that was uniquely yours, that kind of spoke directly to you? Maybe you and maybe your own research, or when you were like, almost like the Leo DiCaprio, gif that we see online or so forth. Was there a moment when you watched this movie like, oh, that's I know this, right? That's my thing.
Maybe because I was eager to find that moment. But like early on, I actually think the opening scene for me is really exciting.
Really?
Like, which it's actually kind of similar to the original, like the one that it's loosely based on, the Cage aux Folles, in French. And like this kind of moment, like the scenes of South Beach in this era, to me, bring me joy. Like that, it's
Oh my
the Art
God,
Deco
yes.
buildings. It's
Yes.
like, I also, as a historian, know, like as I said, like that those buildings almost weren't kept, right? Like that there was a moment where people, it took activists on the ground, including many Jewish American activists, who were largely being displaced from this space and at this time of the film, to preserve so much of the South Beach look that we imagine today, the Art Deco buildings and the kind of the access to the ocean, and those smaller streets, and it's become, and there's something really interesting. I don't want to kind of go too deep into this because it's just like a whole, right? Like, but historically in Miami and in South Florida, the most kind of prized access to real estate has been that close to the water, like that which is closest to the water. And with climate crisis, we're seeing a very different, kind of reevaluation of so much of Miami is already below sea level. So the kind of historic places that have higher elevation have historically been Black communities, like Little Haiti, for example, which has higher elevation. And we're seeing this kind of like climate gentrification emerge. There's this great historian and scholar of Miami, Nadege Green, who's written this really fabulous piece about climate gentrification. And it's accelerating at such a massive, because like now places like South Beach are becoming more cause for alarm for development, even though in some other ways we're still seeing massive. I mean, it's very expensive to live here, incredibly expensive, and things like home insurance are almost entirely unavailable to most folks, right? In a time where we're obsessed with, whether drag queens can live and perform, or who gets access to the bathroom, people can't afford their rent and have access to no housing. That is like there's such massive things that we're not taking care of, or that the government and the local government and the state government are not looking enough to.
There are people in Tallahassee who are absolutely disinterested in whether or not people can afford to live in Florida.
That's not what they want, right? And they keep telling us, like, look at all these people who are coming to Florida. So like it's literally gentrification at the state level. Like that is like, if Floridians can't afford to live here, the government tells us, we'll bring others. Like that is like, we'll bring people who can afford to live here from Chicago and from San Francisco and from New York. Like, and that was super true, or especially true during the pandemic, right? Like that is, it's gentrification on a statewide scale. Like that is like, all right, if you can't afford to live here, leave. Or whatever, right? Like that's what the government is all saying. We'll replace you. And the numbers, and to be fair, the numbers do show that people moved in really massive numbers to Florida after 2020. Like that is actually true. It's not for the reasons that people are saying so. Like it really, there was just cheaper for some folks, right? Like if you were paying much more rent in New York or something, and you had access to, there's less density here, or more density, I should say, here, right? So during the pandemic, this was a really different place.
Well, I've seen this, and this is a thing I speak about a lot, because I was living in Stewart, which is about 40 minutes north of West Palm Beach. And if for people who aren't familiar with Stewart, it was really like the last fishing village in South Florida. It's kind of Treasure Coast kind of area and things like that. And what happens as a result of this influx of people, right, is that, guys, local elections matter, because as people came in, and Stewart and Martin County, which is the county just north of Palm Beach County, for people who don't know, had really fought off a lot of the overdevelopment that had really kind of taken over Palm Beach County, and then had kind of gone up to St. Lucie County. And they had kind of fought off the development for the longest time, until ultimately the influx of people, largely from New York and New Jersey — I make jokes about them as invasive species in my book — changed the local laws to allow for the development. And so now we're seeing like the Florida scrub, which, Julio, I love. Like if you get out and you see like people who aren't familiar with like the interior of Florida, to see like these beautiful palm trees and these sandy kind of soils and gopher tortoises and all this kind of stuff, like that's really a Florida that I adore.
I love Florida kitsch.
Right. Yeah, right. These spaces are getting bulldozed throughout the peninsula now, as a result of this influx of population caused by the DeSantis regime, I guess is maybe the right word. If you're listening, hi, Ron, how you doing? So your heels look great. So,
I'm sure he loves me, I'm sure.
Well, it's personal to me, Julio, as well, because I'm not in Florida right now. The reason why I'm not in Florida is because that crackdown on education made jobs that you have and jobs that I wanted hard to find. End of story. And that is, it's a bitter, angry thing for me. So am I pounding on my desk at Ron DeSantis? No. But it is like, hey, am I ever going to get home at some point in time? Just because, is it possible to come back to Florida? And these are stories, I read this over and over and over again on social media, where people are like, I can't live here anymore because my homeowner's insurance is too high. I can't rent here anymore because my rent, my owner of the home had to jack up my rent $500 to account for this stuff. So that you're
No
absolutely, the
doubt.
changing
No doubt.
demographics of Florida is heartbreaking right now. Man, I think that's our what the Florida moment. I mean, we didn't even like, we just went on a tangent. We're like, we got serious all of a sudden. We apologize.
I mean, yeah, like so I think about this stuff obviously all the time. And it's, it's, um, it's complicated because I also, it's complicated. I mean, obviously it's complicated for a zillion reasons, but it's also complicated because I don't think it's Ron DeSantis. Like that is Ron DeSantis is like a symptom of something that's happening,
That's fair.
more broadly. I mean, it's also DeSantis. Like that is, I'm not like that. I don't want to be
He's
like,
not the whole, he's not the whole thing.
no.
It's far more expansive than DeSantis.
It's super. And like, and the reason I think that's super important is that I always worry about what's going to happen like a year and a half, like whoever's in power or whatever, that we don't understand this as being some kind of isolated moment. It's a significant moment, no doubt. But it's been decades in the making for sure. Whether it's like the defunding of public education, the changing of access to resources and the redistribution of resources, whether it's like immigration reform or talk about immigration reform, changes in foreign policy. Like there's just like all these things are very now it's going to sound like I'm just plugging stuff, but and I maybe am. But I'm literally writing a new book about this. That is like I've largely thought that Florida has kind of been a kind of laboratory of sorts for the nation's culture wars for many, many decades. Like, and there is something. It's like the Florida effect. I like but there is something very distinct about the demographics here. About its kind of relationship to foreign policy, especially the Cold War, that makes Florida a kind of lightning rod for so many of the nation's larger questions today, but also one that gets kind of sampled here and then kind of exported elsewhere, sometimes even internationally, right? Florida is Florida is so deeply understudied, and yet so critically important to understanding how the nation goes, and what's going to happen in the nation for sure. And I think we would do well to pay more attention. Like something's going to go wrong in the election, as it always does. It's not just hanging chads, like there's big, and then we don't really take it seriously. We're just like, oh, we'll figure it out in 4 years or 2 years or whatever. And in the meantime, lots of shit is going down. So like, it's really important that that's the reason I kind of want to move it away from Ron DeSantis, because I want to disempower him and also say that he is just a symptom of so many things that are happening.
Yeah, God, I think you're so right, and it's a thing I've argued. My own work is in 17th, 18th centuries, 19th centuries in Florida, and I'm like, the roots of America are Florida's part of these stories too. And if you, like you're saying, you can't understand the United States without understanding Florida, and I don't know that people outside the peninsula have really started to wrestle with this yet. And that's part of the reason why I was like, I got to have Julio on the show, because I was like, we got to talk about these places. We got to talk about these people, these lives who were lived, and frankly, the lives who were at stake here,
Those most vulnerable. Yeah.
I want to move to a little bit here and move back in time and I want to get into your work specifically. I want to get into Fairyland. And the reason why is because, okay, this film takes place in 1996, but that is 100 years after what the Foundation on Miami or something along these lines. Gay people lived in Miami well before the 90s, way before the Clinton administration. Can we talk about your book and what is Fairyland, and can we talk about these stories and so forth? So can you kind of introduce us to, first of all, the idea is like, first, what is Fairyland to begin with? And then we'll kind of backtrack and kind of go in.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And actually, until you said it, I hadn't put that together. But actually, if the Birdcage came out in 1996, and it did, it's exactly 100 years from the founding of Miami. That it's from Miami proper, not South Beach. That is kind of, I did that on purpose. I founded, no, I, just for this very moment.
Good job.
I do what I can. I think there's something really kind of important about, like that's the part, I think that's one of the reasons I really appreciated that intro scene, like that kind of opening scene in the film, is that it provides like this kind of story of Miami being this playground, right? Like that is like, you get this sense of like, you know, and that's historically been true. Miami, its very founding was this idea of like it was the Las Vegas of its day. Like, you know, what happens in Miami kind of stays in Miami, and it allowed folks to kind of imagine, often vis-a-vis, you know, the opening of new playgrounds, like metaphorical, and playgrounds like Cuba and Havana, right, under U.S. influence, of where one could kind of find pleasure, right, and entertainment, leisure, and possibly explore other aspects of things that they couldn't do in the industrial North or the Midwest, or so to speak, right? Like, it was kind of a place for, in some ways, like Lou Perez has argued in his work on Cuba and sometimes in Florida, it was almost like a metaphorical whore, right? Like, where you could experiment with certain things, and part of that sometimes included, for those who so wanted, right, gender and sexuality, and often at the kind of intersections of race and ethnicity, and of course all these things that influence our understanding of those things. So I in that kind of intro, in that opening scene, we kind of get the sense like drag performances have been a kind of mainstay of Miami's tourist economy. You know, but by 1940, Miami was the largest, least industrial major city in the United States, almost entirely dependent on tourist dollars, right? And that kind of tourist driven economy really nudges Miami towards becoming a kind of wide open town, right? Like this fairyland, so to speak, right? And it really is competing after, especially after the opening of the aviation industry, where it's easier to travel to places like Havana, right? Which through the tentacles of U.S. empire becomes a really accommodating playground, so to speak, for Americans, like that is U.S. Americans. So like it's kind of pushing Miami towards becoming a much more lax place in terms of what you can do or can't do here. But that's really if you're white, right? Like that's if you're white, mostly middle or upper class or aspirationally so. Generally more true for men than for women. And less so, right, for people of color, for immigrants and working class folks. So Fairyland really was, you know, dependent on who you were. It was as accommodating as it could be if you were of privilege, right? Like that is if you were of class and racial privilege. For white queer folks, that might mean X, Y, or Z. Like, you know, and for people of color, it often turned out to being like in service of a white fairyland, right? Like that is, so it really depended on who you were and how you were able to navigate parts of this. But because of its kind of dependency on tourist driven dollars and pesos, right? Because that is the migration, that the tourism also came from the South, right? Like that is from the Caribbean and parts of Latin America. It was really accommodating if you were a white man. Um, like that's just the story, and we get a sense of that a little bit in that opening scene, right? Even 100 years later, right? That it maintains its kind of playground mentality for most of the nation, even though, of course, it's radically changed by then. Its economy has diversified, no doubt. Its dependency on tourism has been weakened for sure. Its investment in Latin America and capital has changed, but that kind of historic connection to Latin America and the Caribbean is at least 100 years in the making by the time this film happens, and certainly its kind of association as being a kind of playground for the rest of the nation and beyond is certainly visible in this film too.
I want to talk to you about immigration. It plays a huge role in this book. And I would tell you that, when I was living in Florida and I would talk to other white guys, I don't want to go to Miami. I can't speak Spanish, blah, blah, blah. Like, and I'm just like, pendejo, you live in La Florida, right? I mean,
yeah.
Why would you not like expect Spanish to be spoken in Miami? Can we talk about how immigration plays into the development of a queer Miami, or the foundations and roots of what Miami becomes in, say, by 1996, or even, my God, 28 years later, as we're sitting here now? Where are immigrants? Because Miami's this massive. It's like it's in North America, but it's like this nexus. It's this point of entry to the Caribbean and South America.
Yeah, and this is this was really important for me in the book, and everything I've done since then. Like, neither here nor there, but like my dissertation was not my book project. My dissertation was LGBTQ Miami after the 1940s, and it was largely about how essentially Black civil rights and immigration rights kind of altered and kind of informed the LGBTQ movement in Miami, from the 40s to the 90s. So like essentially kind of ends at this moment that the Birdcage takes place, even though the Birdcage isn't mentioned in my dissertation. But that is in part because I was thinking about, how different Miami was earlier. Like reading books like George Chauncey, like the earlier pre-1940 studies of gay urban history are pretty rare. There aren't many, in large part because I could talk about this forever, but it's different. It's different to study because you're not really looking at identities. You're looking at behaviors and changes in culture, right? Because like it's not really until after the 1940s that we see the kind of crystallization or kind of further accentuation of LGBTQ identity. So like, and that's true for, people increasingly understand themselves as gay, as lesbian, so to speak, right after the 1950s. So before that, like, who do you determine to look at? Like, how do you decide what you're going, and that's especially true, right, for queer folks of color who are being policed for everything, right? Like that is, so like the people most vulnerable, I sought out to write a book of how differently would queer urban history look like if this was done transnationally, if we understood Miami as a part of the Bahamas, a part of Haiti, a part of Cuba, and we put queer folks of color at the center of the story. And it turns out the story looks really different, right? Like that is, the periodization is really different. Understandings of culture are really different. The influences of how people navigated parts of their lives. I was hoping to push people into asking critical questions about the role that race, ethnicity, and migration and mobility at large really did in shaping queer culture. And a big part of that really is that and like as we said, right, like fairyland really depended on who you were and what you had access to, and what time in history you were able to navigate that, right? Like that is, if we understand prohibition as being this key moment that changes queer culture, what about the Cuban Revolution of 1933 and what that does to shut down certain things and move people into Miami, right? What happens when like there's this moment in my book where I discovered that there's a gay bar that's raided in Miami in November of 1937, but it's not raided by the police officially, at least not that time, and it's complicated about who was wearing the hood that night, but it was raided by the Ku Klux Klan. What does it mean in Miami for the Ku Klux Klan to raid a gay bar called La Paloma? It's just such a quintessential Miami story. People often kind of think about it outside of being a Jim Crow, southern city, outside of being a kind of key place to understand mobility, migration. A big part of the book is as I mentioned earlier, is the centrality of Black Bahamians in changing the culture. Even though Black Bahamians represented they were the largest immigrant community at the time, in the early 1900s. They're still a minority. That is, like, this is a white majority space in Miami in the Jim Crow South. What did it mean to be Black, to be immigrant, to be working class at this time? But they're also heavily policed for same-sex crimes, right? And it's not, of course, to suggest that they are having same-sex, committing same-sex acts in higher numbers, but rather they're being policed more heavily. Like, that is, like, how do we kind of understand these things outside of just criminality and surveillance, and trying to find cultural sources? This was really important to me. That is, I didn't want to rely too heavily on criminal sources, which is often what we do. Because imagine if all of your life is told through a lens of, like, how do we tell the histories of people whose lives were never meant to be told, right? Like, that is, any kind of appearance of them is told through the lens of criminality or surveillance. So when they are able to, when in the kind of fractures of their lives that exist in cultural sources, I took those very, very seriously and sought to recover aspects of their lives. And sometimes that didn't exist just in the United States, right? There were in archives in New Providence and Nassau, in the capital of the Bahamas, which of course at that time was a British colony. Anyway, neither here nor there. But that is, these are complicated things to do. And I think we need more of it, right? Like that is, I think we need much more work in queer history that centers queer of color folks and voices, and what that means to understanding urban history, immigration history. Queer history is immigration history, is Black history, is Latino history, Latinx history, and so forth, right?
Yeah. Okay. So that was one of the questions I had. So really, is I have been able to interview like the absolute best like scholars, working in history, yourself included, right? People whose work absolutely just fascinates me. One of the things I've become fascinated with is like, how do you do the work? Especially like you were just saying, like about the lived experiences of these people who unfortunately had to keep such an important aspect of their lives shrouded at
Yeah.
times.
Yeah.
So where do you find are you working in oral histories here? Are you talking to descendant communities? How do you tell this story? Where do you even begin to probe to understand queer Miami before the war?
It's a great question. I will say that immigrants are a perfect example of the kind of, for me, the need for transnational work. Because their archives, right, much like they're literally transnational folks, right? Like that is like, they don't just exist in one space, they are crossing borders and boundaries. But so too are aspects of their lives. Like that is, if I was to only, like one key example that I often think about is if I was only to have looked at the Miami files and whether it's immigration logs or criminal records, or even kind of city minutes and these kinds of like more official records, I would get the sense, right, that there's this like when the Black Bahamians come in large numbers in the early 1900s to help build, they're mostly doing agricultural work, and building things like the railroads and some of the kind of early buildings and structures. And sometimes they move further north, like down to Broward County and then Palm Beach County and so on and so forth, right? As they kind of often follow the railroad. And most folks went back, right? Like that is, it was often seasonal because if it was agricultural related, they would often go back to especially parts of the northern Bahamas. And if we were to believe the Miami-based sources and those in those archives, right, we would get the sense that Black Bahamian men were the only ones who came or wanted to come. And then if you go to the Bahamas and do that exact same research in different archives, you learn that simply wasn't true. Black Bahamian women were trying to come to Miami in equal numbers, but they simply weren't admitted. Like that is, they were often kind of flagged at the U.S. at the Miami port, because if they came unaccompanied, that is outside of the supervision or guardianship of a man, whether a married woman or a father, right? They were understood likely to be a public charge, right? They're likely to become a public charge clause and often sent back. So that is, if we only looked at that through Miami, we would get the sense of like, yeah, the only men wanted to come, but that simply wasn't true. Looking at the colonial records, right, again, it was a British colony at the time, they're paranoid. They're so like losing their minds that there's no men in these northern islands of the Bahamas. Like the Bahamas is hundreds of islands, right? Often quite isolated. So depending on what island you are, there's a different history. And they're just like, well, there's just no men here. These are entirely women dominated spaces. What are we going to do? And then at the same time, like something similar is happening, almost in a reverse way, right? Where they're talking about the kind of problem of like, there's too many Bahamian men in Miami don't have access to women, and what's going to happen, like these kind of anxieties, very gendered migration patterns and anxieties. But it's there's no way that we can't imagine the kind of shaping of queer culture as somehow not being dependent on restrictionism and immigration, because it was a part of the story, right? They kept women from not coming here. Here meaning Miami, as I said, in Fort Lauderdale. Also,
did you have a moment in the archive when you were just like, when this hit you, where you're just like, we're in the Bahamas or someplace like that, where you're like, holy shit, they can't come?
Yeah, I did. I had a few moments, like sodomy, for example, like which is not it's not an indicator, right, of same sex, whatever. Like to prosecute someone for sodomy was really complicated and really difficult. But Bahamians were overrepresented in sodomy cases. I was able to put like through immigration records to see who was there, and like who they were and where they came from. And often there was, even after someone was accused of something, like which was a felony charge in Miami and that is in Florida, these are state felonies. You see, like that is, you see this one sliver of someone's life, like being accused of sodomy, a felony charge, What would that have meant for a Black immigrant during this time? At the same time, you see them return through immigration records back to places like back to the Bahamas. And what did it mean then to did you stop from coming to Miami the next year? Actually, most of the evidence suggests not, right? Like that is that there was who was keeping records of these kinds of. It's not like immigration and the local sheriff's office or something was keeping these sharing these records, and they needed labor, right? It's a complicated story, and one of the hardest parts about doing this kind of work for me, like there's this one moment where I read about this Black Bahamian woman who comes to Miami. She leaves the northern Bahamas to she comes on a boat, and she comes with like a marriage license in her hand, right? Like that's what the record says, hoping that she would become a respectable woman so she's allowed to disembark because she knows that otherwise she would be understood as likely to become a public charge. And they don't allow her to get married at that point, and they send her back, and like they describe her as like being in sobs, like she just sobbed. And the thing about these are really difficult stories because she was trying to reunite with parts of her family, of friends, and forms of community. These are often they're nameless people. Like I don't know that woman's name. And there are so many other women like her whose stories have been lost to us because they weren't recorded. They weren't intended to be recorded. So whenever we get kind of these fragments of people's lives that are so incredibly powerful and underserved and certainly not told, it falls on us, right, to tell them with dignity and respect. And it's not easy because there's so much of their life has been designed to be about not offering them respect and dignity, right? So I have to say I relied heavily on cultural sources. When available to me, I took these cultural sources very seriously for what they offered me and what they were trying to say to me, thinking about them at the time and the place that they were created. That is, I put them alongside things like criminal records and immigration logs so that there can be a greater essence and texture to the people's lives who were otherwise lost to us.
We talked about Chauncey's book, which I was introduced when I was a master's student at Wichita State. We were just doing a broad reading. It was the very first gay-centered history I'd ever read, and I was like, what the fuck is this? Because it's such a fucking beast of a book. It's such a beautifully written book. It's so good. I love that.
It really is.
It's one of my top 15 books I've ever read. I just love it so much.
It makes me so happy.
Oh, are you kidding me? It's just so goddamn good. And this comes from a guy whose expertise is not in New York. It's not in gay history. It was just like here was my first entrance into this world that I did not know, and it was like that's what a good book does, right? I'm kind of wondering, are there books that have influenced you in your career? I'm assuming aside from Chauncey's book, are there books that you look back and go, God, these are the books that really move me, whether they are gay histories or immigration histories or, anything else? What gets to you? What are the books that really drive you that you get misty about?
Oof. Goodness,
because I got it, man. I could name mine, but what are yours?
Yes, for sure. Something like Chauncey's book for sure influenced me. That is, it was hard for me not to be in conversation with him because I was also when I first read George Chauncey, it also blew my mind, right? That is, I didn't understand that I could do this history, right? That is, it was the first queer history that, and actually, I think Louis Ehrenberg's I read coming out. That is, it's coming out, stepping out. That was kind of the nightlife culture of New York and Chicago. At this point, I was again, a non-degree seeking student. I was just a journalist. And I was just I didn't know anything about graduate school. I didn't know anything, anyway, neither here nor there, but I was entirely by accident. So when I first had to read a monograph or something, I was like, what is this? And why is this so,
so many pages?
Really? No one kind of prepares folks who have less, familiarity with this world, right? That is with graduate school and with, and that was, I was navigating a lot of this kind of on my own. And I have to say, I'm kind of in my own way, I'm really grateful for it because I found my own path in ways that felt comfortable to me. But yeah, when I read George Chauncey, it kind of opened my mind. I will say, so of course, the kind of texts, in queer history, no doubt, George Chauncey, Mark Stein's work, Nyan Shaw and Kevin Munford were so important to the way I thought about Kevin Murphy's book. Like that is thinking
Oh,
about these things
Kevin.
often. Yeah, like thinking
Yeah, I
about
saw
all
the
these
guy.
things differently. Oh, amazing, man! All these folks are incredible. And like I was also the kind of key questions that I had were often much more in conversation with folks who were doing immigration history, Latinx history, and Black history. So um, like May Nye's work was super, super important to think to shaping the way I thought about constructions of race and ethnicity. Um, Maria Cristina Garcia's Havana, USA, even though it's a much later period, shaped so much of the way I understood early Miami. Same with Nathan Connolly's work, right, on A World More Concrete. To think about like people who started taking Miami very seriously, right? Like there was until very recently, there was like no Miami, there was very little Miami scholarship. And that's changing very quickly. And I'm so grateful that
Thank
it's like,
God.
yeah, we need much, much more of it. Ana Raquel Mignon's book, like Undocumented Lives, we got to know each other very well, and we had writing groups in the Keys actually, where Ana was writing Undocumented Lives, and we would share our works and we would read together, whether it was transnational thinking or thinking about what it means to do research in several languages, right? Like some of my sources are in Spanish, and actually many of them are, and some of them are in French, like, and some of them are. And what does it mean to not like that is as a I mean, neither here nor there, but I also think that was one of the things I wasn't, having grown up in South Florida, some of the kind of skills I had that I maybe took for granted, like that is, not everyone can speak several languages or be able to, and sometimes we're not trained to understand those things as benefits, the way that and that we bring really important voices and skills to the profession, and that's become something really important for the work now as a mentor and an advisor for my students, often who are multilingual, first generation, and so forth, for them to be like, you bring really, really important skills into this world. And the academy often doesn't prize or value those skills, but I'm here to tell you that they matter, and that and so many other folks are too. But that is, I felt very, in addition to, I did my postdoc at Yale, and I got to know, George in that way, and Joanne Meyerowitz, of course, but also the actually even more so, like a lot of the scholars of Latinx history and queer history. Stephen Pitty was, as a scholar of Latinx history, has been one of the most important mentors to me in shaping the way that I thought. That it was at that moment where I started thinking Jafari Allen too, when he was back at Yale, and then he came to Miami. We became really, anyway, neither here nor there. But like, it's it was at that moment where I was like, should I, as a postdoc, I was revising my dissertation, which is entirely a different topic, where I was just like, maybe I should just, and then I was like, I have different questions I want to ask. And then as I kind of started revising it and asking those questions, I had this really ambitious idea of writing this one chapter, like, here's everything that happened in queer Miami pre 1940, and I'll just throw it in. And I went to to do art, archival work, and I found actually those stories about Bahamians, and I couldn't stop. Like, I literally just put the dissertation to the side and said, there's a story here that's dying to be told that I feel like I couldn't think about anything else.
Was that
And
scary, Julio?
yeah, I was very fortunate because I had a tenure track position at UMass Amherst, which I earned tenure there 7 years later. But when you're on the tenure stream, you're on a clock, right? Like, and it's really dangerous to
Scary?
take on
Yeah.
a new project that you haven't vetted by other people. You don't have a committee of folks to read your work. And to be fair, lots of people discouraged me from doing this. They were like, my dissertation had won just a big dissertation prize from the Urban History Association for the best dissertation on urban history. I had done well, right? Like, I had lots of other things to say for that, but it's not where my head was. And I shifted focus, which was probably, I don't recommend it to anybody because was tired, but
Totally.
I like to think that my work was responding to the questions I was asking at the time, and that for me, that fueled me, and that's still the reason I'm writing this book about the Florida, the centrality of Florida as kind of a laboratory for the nation's culture wars, is because that's what's consuming me right now, right? Like, that is, and that's the way that I do my work. But I don't think that I'm not suggesting people do it that way. It's probably not healthy.
Can I ask you? I don't get a chance to ask this very often, but you brought it up, and I really want
Yeah.
to, because teaching is so central to the things that I love to do. I hope that people are taking lessons from this. Maybe. Can we talk a little bit about what are you teaching over at FIU, and like what are your students really relating to themselves? We got this whole new generation of scholars who you are mentoring as well. What are they finding kinship with as you introduce them to works and things like that?
That's a great question. And I mean, I know people say these kinds of things, but I love teaching. Like that is like teaching to me is like a gift, right? Like that is, I feel very fortunate to have the chance to do it. I've taught courses as from immigration history to, I've taught LGBTQ history once, actually only once in Florida, largely because my role has changed. So I'm a joint hire with the history department and the public humanities lab, the Wilsonian Public Humanities Lab. So that is, I a lot of my attention is on doing public facing and public and community based work. I teach public history almost every year. So really thinking about what we can do in terms of the intersections of doing public facing work and our work as scholars and thinkers and historians. I you know it's the survey, for example, like it's an opportunity to introduce folks to, and I get to teach the survey less than I used to, in large part because my course loads are different, and they've changed over the years, in large part because I'm doing the service, right? So I've taught a course on Miami history, which is something that's pretty distinct. I was the public history coordinator for 6 years, so supervising internships. My coursework is it's pretty varied. So from Caribbean to LGBTQ to immigration to Latinx history, I supervise a number of different things. Sometimes for comps fields, and sometimes at the level. But I enjoy teaching a lot. It sounds like a sample or something. Like I'm just like I'm up for a job.
Dude, when I was going to those interviews, I tell you what, I'll tell you, like you say this, like I always felt like when I was interviewing for those positions, I was trying to give them the answer I thought people wanted to hear, instead of just like, I don't know. I feel like now, when I talk to folks, I'm like Morgan Freeman in Shawshank Redemption. I'm like, I just here, whatever.
Yeah. Now you should just answer the way you want to answer.
Yeah, like, look, you've never heard of HATM? I want to bring this back to the film. How does this movie change 28 years later? If we look at the Birdcage now, if we remake this film now, are we still talking about the same kinds of things? Are people having to be as shrouded in their lives? Can you remake the Birdcage? Is it relevant now to think that people would have to hide because of marriage equality, because of the demographics of Miami now? What happens?
It's a great question. And I would love for there to be a kind of modern take. I mean, that's essentially what the Birdcage was. It was like a reimagining of La Cage aux Folles, right? Like the French film in the 70s. Like what would it mean to kind of put this moment in South Beach, Miami, which was like a gay
right?
mecca. Yeah. So like maybe we are due for a kind of reimagining of it. It's interesting because of course I don't want to ever make light of the progress we've made, right? Like that is in terms of we do have marriage equality. We have, although that's also increasingly under attack, and the possibilities of its attacks. But we also are. There's lots of things that we have, where we see very little progress or massive kind of obstacles to seeing more progress. Whether that's in immigration reform, whether that's the desegregating of spaces in places like Miami and climate gentrification. Like South Beach doesn't look that way anymore, right? Like that is, it's not a gay mecca the way that it used to be, and it largely, but the part that does remain is the whiteness. Like that is. So there's what does it mean to do the Birdcage in 2024 or whatever, in a moment where there's trans people are under attack, where Black history is under attack, where immigrants, right, are very much under attack, where there's less access to. I mean, all these stories would change what it would mean to kind of recreate the Birdcage, and maybe that's what we need to do, is to kind of like find new ways to tell these stories, because that's one of the things that this film I think does. is tell us this really important story about where so many folks were in the 1990s. And sometimes it's easier to see it in retrospect, right? Kind of looking behind us in the rearview mirror. But there's an opportunity here for us to expose other folks who might still think of Florida in X, Y, or Z way, or only through the lens of like, don't say gay, or these kinds of things, in a way that could be really, I hope, a kind of agent for change. I think film has the power to do something like that.
Well, I think you sort of hit on our final question here, which is this: is the Birdcage a history movie?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's definitely a history movie. I'm not super sure I know what that means, but like that is like
nobody knows what it means. It's entirely free. It is.
Yeah, like would I want people to take this movie seriously, which for me is what history is. Like if history is kind of change over time, can we look at the Birdcage today and understand where, like, how differently that was from Anita Bryant in the 1970s or Ron DeSantis in 2023 and 2024? Yeah, I think the Birdcage is a snapshot in a moment in time when this space represented something really different to a lot of different folks and provided some folks with perhaps glimmers of hope, opportunity, ideas of family, and perhaps for others it represented invisibility and lack of representation. And but for sure, I feel very comfortable understanding this as a historic snapshot. And for that, like, in selfishly, again, as we were preparing for this, I kind of want to write about the Birdcage in ways that, if I'm honest, I had never felt so inspired. So I'm excited for us to continue to take these kinds of sources really seriously, because they are serious.
That's awesome, Julio, dude. I am so happy we were finally able to put this together. This was like, I say this every time, and I always look forward to these conversations I have with people, but I was really looking forward to getting into this for so many reasons. You. So, dude, thank you so very much for being here and coming on and just trusting this HATM thing and, talking to us about the brilliancy of your work, how much we love Florida, the importance of talking about these kinds of things. So, God, this was awesome. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Jason. I had fun.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of Movies Podcast. Thank you so very much to our guest, Julio Capó Jr. Julio, thank you. Oh my gosh, that was a blast. I'm sitting here with a big smile on my face. That was just the best conversation. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our guest, to our producer. I guess you're a guest, Fletcher. Thank you to Fletcher Powell for producing this show. And thank you to you guys, the listeners, for continuing to listen in and share this. If there are episodes, if there are movies you want us to talk about, let us know. If you want to sponsor this show, we are now taking sponsorship applications. You can hit us at historiansatthemovies.com. Thank you so much for being part of the HATM community. Spending time with you guys means the absolute world to me. Hope you enjoyed the episode today. Ciao for now.